When they pulled the curtain back, I honestly thought it was a joke that had gone too far. The case stood in the middle of the new gallery under clean white lights, the kind that made everything look expensive and harmless. Inside it was a night guard in a navy blazer with a museum patch on the breast, a ring of keys clipped to his belt, and a coffee stain on the right cuff where mine always ended up because I carried cups in that hand. His head was turned slightly to the left, like he had just heard something in a hallway and hadn't decided yet whether to check it. It was me, not a rough likeness, not an artist's reconstruction. Me. The small scar under my chin from a bicycle crash when I was 11. The flattened bridge of my nose from high school wrestling. Even the cracked black watch I still wore because I never got around to replacing it. People around me leaned in, reading the plaque with polite interest. A woman laughed softly at one line. Someone behind me said, "They always do such detailed work here." Then I saw Walter in the crowd. He stood near the wall in the same gray raincoat he had worn the night he disappeared from himself. He met my eyes and smiled like we shared a private joke. I stepped closer to the glass and read the name on the brass plate. Owen Mercer. Under it, in smaller lettering, was the first line of my life. I did not remember walking into that room. 3 months earlier, I took the job because I needed to disappear. My name is Owen Mercer, and 3 months before the exhibit opened, I started working nights at the Alder Museum of Natural History. Officially, I took the job because I needed regular pay and something that didn't ask too many questions. That much was true. I had burned through most of my savings after leaving my last position, and the kind of work I was qualified for came with references, background calls, and people who liked to compare notes. Unofficially, I was hiding. A year earlier, I had been hired to protect a private collection owned by a wealthy donor outside Hartford. The collection included old coins, religious carvings, funeral masks, small things with paperwork that mattered more than the objects themselves. I sold 3 of those objects through a man I knew from college who claimed he could move anything if it was quiet enough. It had seemed temporary at the time. I told myself I would put the money back before anyone noticed inventory discrepancies. People always say things like that before they ruin their own lives. Nobody traced it to me. No police showed up. No one called. But once you do something like that, you start waiting. Every unknown number becomes a problem. Every delayed email feels loaded. I left town before anyone could ask why. The museum sat near the edge of downtown, a block of old limestone and newer glass joined together by a renovation somebody had probably won an award for. During the day, it was full of school groups, strollers, retirees, and kids dragging sticky fingers along display glass while parents apologized to volunteers. I only saw that version twice, once during my interview and once during orientation. After that, the building belonged to nights. At night, the place felt older than it looked. You noticed sounds you missed in daylight. Vents ticking on and off behind walls. The slow complaint of pipes. The soft electrical hum of lit display cases. The mammal hall had a faint smell of dust and preserved fur. The fossil wing smelled like dry stone and floor cleaner. The archaeology rooms had that cool, stale scent you get in church basements and archive stacks, paper and cloth and old air that had been folded over itself for years. The museum had 4 floors above ground and 1 below. The public maps in the lobby showed only the 4. Employee maps skipped from ground-level service corridors to mechanical access points without ever making a clean reference to what was under us. I noticed it because I notice omissions. People think secrets are hidden by what is present. Most of the time, they're hidden by what gets left out. Orientation was brief. I got a ring of keys, a radio with a strip of white tape marked Mercer in blue ink, a schedule, and a slim employee handbook whose cover was worn soft at the corners. Most of it was what you would expect. Emergency exits, fire response, visitor incidents, who to call if a pipe burst, how to log broken cases, where not to leave carts during events. Near the back, on a page of restricted access policies, there was one line set apart from the rest. Basement access remains prohibited. Never open the basement. Not avoid. Not restricted to senior staff. Not open only in emergency. Never open it. I remember putting my thumb on that line and reading it twice to make sure I wasn't missing something above or below that explained the wording. There was nothing. Just that sentence sitting there as if it were completely normal. My supervisor was a short, careful man named Dennis Shaw who wore knit ties and always looked as if he had just come from apologizing to someone richer than him. I asked him about the basement while he showed me the security office. He gave a quick smile that didn't settle on his face properly. Old building language, he said. Language for what? Restricted storage. Why say never? He set a spare flashlight in a drawer, lined it up with the others, and shut the drawer a little too hard. Because people get curious. That answer should have done the job. It should have told me enough. The problem was that curiosity has always sounded to me less like a warning than a challenge. My first weeks were quiet. I signed in at 10, checked radios, reviewed the event schedule, walked the main floors, watched the loading dock monitor, and logged the usual small things. Motion alarms caused by air pressure shifts, a janitorial closet left unlocked, a leaking sink in the second-floor staff restroom, a cracked bulb over the marine life diorama. There were 3 other regular night guards besides me. Walter Boone was the senior man, heavy-set, broad-shouldered even in his 60s, always in the same gray raincoat if the weather so much as hinted at rain. Then there was Lena Ortiz, younger than Walter but older than me, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, the kind of person who noticed if a chair had been moved an inch. The last was a part-timer named Ravi who worked weekends and spent most of his shift studying for the civil service exam. Walter barely spoke unless he had to. Lena spoke when necessary and not much beyond that. Ravi talked enough for everybody. By the end of my second week, I knew the building well enough to walk some corridors with my flashlight off. I knew which motion sensors ran hot, which stairwell door liked to stick in damp weather, and which displays made children cry during evening family programs. I also knew there was a freight elevator at the end of a service corridor behind the anthropology wing, and that everyone acted strangely around it. It was old, metal-gated inside the newer outer doors, meant for crates and rolling carts. The call button panel showed one marked level below the ground floor, but the label plate had been removed so thoroughly that even the screws were gone. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody used it while I was watching. Still, every time I passed that corridor, I found myself looking down it a second too long. It was clean in the way places get clean when people are trying not to leave evidence of attention. Waxed floor. No abandoned carts. No loose packing straps. A red exit sign at the far end that cast just enough light to make the elevator doors look darker. On my 4th week, while I was turning pages in the handbook during a slow hour, I saw the rule again. Never open the basement. This time I noticed a faint indentation on the paper, as if somebody had once pressed a pen hard into the line without marking it. I closed the book and put it away. For the first time since taking the job, I had the clear, unwelcome feeling that I had not found a place to disappear. I had walked into something that had already been waiting. For the better part of a month, nothing happened that I could honestly call strange. That was almost the worst part of it, looking back. Routine has a way of making a bad idea feel manageable. Night after night, the museum settled into patterns so predictable that I started to think the rule was an old administrative leftover, the sort of thing institutions keep because nobody wants to be the person who removes it and then regrets it. I made rounds. I drank stale coffee from the break room machine. I learned which cameras froze for half a second when the network lagged. I stopped jumping at the sudden cry in the bird calls exhibit when a sensor got tripped unexpectedly. The place became ordinary in the way all workplaces do if you spend enough tired hours in them. Then I noticed the elevator. At 1:17 every morning, the freight elevator in the service corridor would descend. Not open. Not receive cargo. Not chime for staff. It would simply arrive on the ground floor, wait exactly long enough for me to wonder whether I should investigate, then move down. Several minutes later, it would return. The first night I caught it, I happened to be passing the anthropology corridor on my rounds. I heard the old motor engage, a low mechanical growl under the floor, then saw the indicator above the door flick from G to an unlabeled blank. I assumed maintenance had scheduled work and forgotten to tell security. The next night, it happened again at the same minute. The night after that, again. By the end of the week, I was waiting for it. No one stepped in. No one came out. The corridor stayed empty. The museum around it stayed quiet. The elevator behaved like part of a routine nobody had bothered to explain to me. I brought it up to Lena during shift change one morning while she was signing off on an incident log. "The freight elevator," I said. "Who's using it after 1?" She kept writing for a second longer than necessary. "What time?" 1:17. That made her stop. She capped the pen and looked at me with a kind of irritation that seemed partly genuine and partly defensive. "You don't need to know. That isn't really an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Is it maintenance?" She slid the logbook toward me. "Did anything happen?" "No." "Then log no incident and leave it alone." I wanted to push harder, but Ravi came in behind us talking about parking enforcement on the street outside, and the moment closed. That night, I skipped one of my rounds and stayed in the security office a few minutes before 1:17. The office sat behind the staff entrance, lined with monitors, old metal filing cabinets, and a desk scarred by decades of coffee cups and clipped reports. One camera covered the freight elevator corridor. At 1:16, the corridor was empty. At 1:17, the outer elevator doors shuttered, then parted a few inches before closing again. The elevator started down. I leaned closer to the monitor. The feed was grainy but stable, black and white after hours to save power. The fluorescent fixture outside the elevator buzzed softly through the audio channel. Nothing moved. Then, for less than a second, something crossed the frame. I did not see it enter from either side. It was simply there and then elsewhere. A tall shape, too narrow through the shoulders, too smooth in motion to be natural. It didn't stride. It didn't limp. It seemed to travel sideways without turning, like a paper figure dragged across glass. I actually checked whether the clip had glitched. I rewound it and watched again. Same empty corridor. Same elevator doors. Same impossible motion between frames. I called up the adjacent cameras. The service hallway that should have shown the figure entering was empty. The loading access feed was empty. The rear stairwell was empty. For a few seconds I sat very still with my hand on the mouse and listened to the office fan click once every rotation because one of the blades was slightly warped. My first thought was not ghost or monster or anything dramatic. It was much smaller and more practical. Someone was in the building. I took the radio and walked to the corridor myself. The floor was clean. The air was cold in the way air gets cold near loading areas, though there were no exterior doors nearby. The elevator indicator was back on G. I listened at the doors and heard nothing beyond them. I almost pressed the call button. I got close enough to see the grime settled along the edge of the metal plate where hundreds of fingers had used it over the years. Then I remembered the handbook wording and stepped back. Never open the basement. I spent the rest of the shift checking exterior locks twice and trying not to think about the figure sliding across the monitor. The next morning, before leaving, I saved the clip to the incident archive. When I came in the following night, it was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The timestamp remained in the system, but the file itself had been deleted, and the auto backup for that camera during that exact minute had somehow failed. I asked Dennis whether IT had done maintenance on the archive. The overhead light gave everything a yellow cast. He kept stirring after the powder dissolved. "Which camera?" he asked. "The corridor by the freight elevator." He set the spoon down. "There isn't a basement camera. I meant the corridor to it." "Then say that. Have you ever seen anything there?" He looked past me at the wall clock. "You read the handbook?" "Yes." "Then you know the rule." "I know the rule. I'm asking why it exists." He finally met my eyes. There was no anger there. What bothered me was that there was no surprise either. "Because not every locked door keeps things out," he said. Then he rinsed his spoon, dried it carefully with a paper towel, and walked out. From that point on, the rule stopped feeling decorative. It became the center of the building. Everything else started arranging itself around it. If Walter Boone had been the kind of man who told stories, I might have handled what happened next differently. There are employees in old buildings who like being gatekeepers. They pass along legends because it gives them status. Walter was not like that. He seemed to hate even the smallest conversation about the museum after midnight. He did his rounds exactly the same way every shift, checked every stairwell lock twice, wrote neat block letters in the incident logs, and left nothing personal in the locker room except a spare raincoat and an old flashlight with a taped handle. He also had habits that did not fit any standard procedure. He never cut through the East Service Hall after midnight, even though it was the shortest route between the fossil prep lab and the loading dock. He always paused at 1:15 and stood where he could hear, but not see, the freight elevator corridor. On rainy nights, he put a line of salt packets from the cafeteria along the inside edge of the security office windowsill. When Ravi noticed and laughed, Walter said it kept the ants away. We never had ants. One night, when he went to the restroom and left his clipboard on the desk, I saw a folded sheet of paper tucked behind the incident forms. I knew I shouldn't read it. I read it anyway. The paper held a list in Walter's block handwriting. Do not answer voices over the radio unless the speaker identifies a current location. Do not enter the East Hall after 12:30 a.m. If the freight elevator arrives twice in 1 hour, remain in a populated room until dawn. If someone enters the basement corridor willingly, do not follow. If a display label contains your name, report it to no one. Leave the building. There were more, some crossed out, some rewritten. One said never look through the freight elevator gate if the inner door is already open. Another, added later in darker ink, said that rule no longer worked. I folded the paper back the way I had found it. When Walter returned, I said nothing. I should probably be ashamed to admit that by then I was less afraid than interested. Fear still feels manageable when it's secondhand. The storm came on a Thursday in late October. It started as a hard evening rain and turned into the kind of weather that makes old windows rattle in their frames. By midnight, the streets outside were slick and nearly empty. Wind pushed water against the lobby glass in bursts. The museum felt sealed off from the city, like a ship that had already left port and simply forgotten to move. There had been a donor event earlier in the evening, so we were running later than usual on closing checks. Walter took the upper floors. I covered ground level and loading access. Lena was off that night. Ravi had called in sick. At 12:43, the main power failed. Everything went black so fast that for a second I thought I had closed my eyes. Then the emergency lights kicked in, low amber strips along the base of the walls and dim ceiling units that left the galleries looking half-developed, as if the museum had been sketched and not finished. Somewhere in the building an alarm chirped once, then stopped when the backup system caught it. The radios went to static for several seconds. "Walter," I said into mine. No reply. I tried again while moving toward the security office. The beam of my flashlight shook more than I liked against the wall displays. In the fossil hall, a mounted mosasaur hung above me in chopped shadows, its teeth flashing white and then vanishing as the beam moved on. The office monitors were down, each screen reflecting my face back at me in dull gray. Dennis wasn't on site. Night supervision ended at 11 unless there was an event. That left me and Walter alone in a building that had suddenly become all corners and echoes. I found him 15 minutes later. The power to the main lights had not returned yet, but backup had restored the freight elevator indicator. That little blank square above the doors was glowing faintly in the dark corridor. Walter stood directly in front of it. He was not collapsed or injured. He was simply standing there with his hands at his sides, facing the closed doors as if he had been waiting to be addressed. My flashlight caught rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat. I remember thinking that made no sense because he had been inside the whole time. "Walter." No response. I moved closer. "Walter, are you hurt?" He turned his head very slowly, not with stiffness exactly but with care, like a man waking from a nap in a strange room and trying to orient himself before speaking. His face looked normal. That was the first bad sign. The second was the expression. Walter was cautious by nature, always slightly guarded. The man who looked at me in that corridor wore an open, mild curiosity that did not belong to him. "Owen," he said. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. His voice sounded correct in pitch and volume, but he spoke my name the way a person reads it from a card. "What happened?" He glanced back at the elevator. "Delivery took longer than usual." "Delivery of what?" He frowned very faintly, as if I were asking why water was wet. "The East Annex specimens. There is no East Annex. His eyes moved to me again. The corridor hummed softly with restored emergency current. You should know that, he said. I radioed for medical assistance once external lines came back. Walter walked to the office under his own power. He answered basic questions, knew the date, knew his own name, knew mine. But over the next hour he referred to rooms and exhibits the museum did not contain. He asked whether the juvenile hominid gallery had reopened. He asked if the Valley glass cases were still sealed after what happened to Claire Voss. There had never been a Claire Voss on staff. He called the Marine Wing the Northern Tank Rooms and asked why the children's quarry had been moved below. Most disturbing of all, he seemed confused that anyone considered the basement restricted. It's always been open, he said. In the same calm tone he might have used to mention the weather. That's where most of the collection is. By morning the main power had stabilized, and Dennis came in with a maintenance crew and a look of exhausted embarrassment, as if he desperately wanted this to be a simple medical event. Walter refused a hospital visit. He signed his own incident statement in careful block letters, but the content barely made sense. He wrote that he had been briefly delayed at intake. Within a week he resigned. The resignation letter was one sentence long. Family reasons. No farewell. No pension lunch. No forwarding address. I checked the locker room the night after he cleared out. His spare raincoat was gone. So was the old flashlight. On the bench where he usually sat to change shoes, there was a tiny crust of white salt. That was when the rule stopped being background noise for me. A man who had spent 20 years obeying it had broken in some way I did not understand. And the building, as far as management was concerned, had simply absorbed the damage and gone on with business. I knew then that if I stayed, I would either need answers or lose the ability to tell myself I wanted them. Museums are built on records. That sounds obvious, but until you work in one, you don't understand how much paper a place can generate in the service of keeping objects still. Loan forms, conservation notes, donor restrictions, climate logs, pest control reports, renovation contracts, transport manifests, insurance riders, accession paperwork. A museum can tell you the humidity around a cabinet on a Wednesday 8 years ago if somebody filed it properly. I started where paper would hide what people would not say. My access as a night guard was limited, but security staff could enter the internal archive reading room if a supervisor signed off. I waited until a slow afternoon before shift, told Dennis I wanted to better understand older floor plans for emergency evacuation routes, and he approved the request without much thought. He seemed pleased I cared. The archive reading room sat off the administrative level. One small space with gray shelving, a metal desk lamp, and archival boxes stacked so neatly they looked staged. The air in there always smelled slightly colder than the rest of the museum. Paper, dust, dry cardboard, that faint bite of old toner. I started with renovation files because buildings reveal secrets when they have been forced to adapt. The museum's public wings had been updated several times over the last 30 years, but 15 years earlier there had been a particularly expensive expansion listed in bland terms. Collection storage integration, subgrade environmental stabilization, transport retrofitting. Subgrade, not basement. The attached documents were thin where they should have been thick. Several folders contained references to appendices that had been removed. There were payment authorizations to contractors with no matching work descriptions. There was one sealed file stub noting transfer to curatorial review. No staff circulation. I kept digging. Eventually I found the excavation. It did not appear under paleontology or archaeology at first. It was buried in development records tied to a donor grant from a foundation I had never heard of. The project title was neutral enough to invite no attention. Regional Survey of Subsurface Biological Anomalies. That was the first phrase that felt wrong in the hands. The expedition had taken place in a remote valley 2 states away, on land quietly purchased through intermediaries. The museum funded it jointly with a university consortium and, for reasons not clearly explained, a private medical imaging firm. The early field reports described sinkholes, unusual mineral deposits, and a cave system with stable temperature and humidity unlike anything expected in the area. Then the language changed. One report referred to articulated remains inconsistent with accepted taxonomic history. Another mentioned soft tissue preservation absent any known mechanism. A third, heavily redacted, described multiple vertebrate forms exhibiting convergent anatomical structures without evolutionary lineage. I read that page 3 times. The sketches in the margins had been photocopied badly, but I could still make out outlines. Something like a cat with an extra shoulder joint. A bird whose skull flared backward in a crest too dense to be decorative. A primate hand with 6 fingers, all proportioned as if the body had evolved to use them. The notes did not read like fakes or cult nonsense. That was what bothered me. They read like frustrated scientists trying to stay precise when precision had stopped helping. The expedition lasted only 5 weeks. On paper, it ended due to safety concerns after a structural collapse in one of the cave approaches. Internally, the language was stranger. Field coherence degraded. Subjective reporting contamination increased. Specimen staging required immediate relocation. Every recovered specimen, according to the transport manifests, had been moved to the museum under sealed handling procedures. Destination: basement storage. Shortly after that, the restricted access policy appeared in internal memos for the first time. Not in the handbook yet, but in circulation notes between administration, security, and curatorial staff. Basement access suspended pending environmental review. Then later, basement access prohibited for non-curatorial personnel. Then, 6 months after the excavation, never open the basement. There were staff incident reports too, though many had been stripped of names. A conservator claimed a display case had appeared in a corridor not yet renovated. A registrar reported being asked for a specimen by a donor who accurately described an item never listed in public holdings. 2 visitors on separate dates identified the same unseen object in comment cards. One wrote, "I'm glad you finally put the woman in blue on display. She looked lonely in storage." There was no known item matching that description. A security report from 13 years earlier made my throat tighten. It described an employee found standing outside the freight elevator at 2:04 a.m., unresponsive for 9 minutes, later claiming he had been reviewing a gallery plan below. The reporting officer's name had been blacked out. The language, though, was clipped and practical in a way I recognized. I wondered if Walter had written it. At the bottom of one maintenance folder, tucked sideways as if added after the fact, I found a memo signed by Margaret Hale, the curator emerita who still kept an office on the 3rd floor. I knew Margaret by sight only. Thin, white-haired, always in dark cardigans, moving slowly but never hesitantly. She had the kind of age that made younger staff speak too loudly around her as if volume replaced respect. Her memo was short. Storage classification is now inaccurate. Recommend discontinuing all spatial terminology that implies containment. That line sat in my head the rest of the day. I left the archive just before staff departure and passed Margaret herself in the hallway. She was carrying a flat archival tray with both hands, her wrists narrow as twigs beneath her sleeves. She stopped when she saw the folder in my arms. "Looking into floor plans?" she asked. It was the exact excuse I had given Dennis. "Yes." She studied my face for long enough that I felt a little absurd holding the folders like a guilty student. Then she nodded once. "No, you aren't," she said. She kept walking. I watched her go, then looked back at the archive room door and understood, with a sinking certainty, that if anyone in the building had answers, it was her, and that she had just told me she knew I was looking. Margaret Hale worked on the 3rd floor in a suite that had once belonged to the head curator and now seemed only half in use. One room held cabinets of uncatalogued papers and a long table under blackout curtains. The other, where she received me 2 nights later, was smaller and warmer, with a kettle on a hot plate and a lamp that cast more light than the overhead fixtures ever managed. She did not ask why I had come. She poured tea into 2 chipped cups with the museum logo printed in dark green and said, "Sit down, Mr. Mercer. If you're here to ask the question everyone eventually asks, I would rather not waste time pretending otherwise." I sat. Up close, she looked even older than I had thought, but not fragile. There was too much attention in her face for fragility. Her hands shook only when still. I read some of the excavation files, I said. I assumed you would. Why is the basement forbidden? She stirred her tea once, though she had added nothing to it. Because rules are easier to print than explanations. That isn't really an answer either. No, she said. It's the institutional version of one. Rain ticked softly against the window. Somewhere beyond her office wall, a cart rolled over tile and then faded away. I told her about the elevator, the deleted footage, Walter after the outage. I did not tell her about Walter's handwritten rules or my own past. I still had the instinct to hold something back from everyone. That habit had outlived its usefulness, but habits usually do. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her cup down and folded her hands over one knee. The specimens brought back from the valley were not dangerous in the ordinary sense, she said. They did not bite, infect, poison, or carry obvious pathogens. They did not reanimate. Nothing broke its case and wandered the building. That would have been simpler. What did they do? They altered certainty. I said nothing. I know how that sounds, she went on. The first reports used different language. Perceptual contamination, associative instability, memory bleed. Each phrase was an attempt to drag the problem back toward familiar ground. None quite fit. She rose and crossed to a filing cabinet, unlocking the top drawer with a key she wore on a thin chain around her neck. From it, she took a photograph in a clear sleeve and handed it to me. The image showed a gallery under construction. Blank walls, sawhorses, rolled carpet, a half-installed case at the far end. In the middle of the room stood a freestanding display plinth that clearly did not belong there. It held what looked like a fossilized infant skeleton with an elongated jaw. That photograph was taken 3 months before the specimen in question arrived on site, Margaret said. Yet there it is. Then the date is wrong. We checked. I studied the print longer than I needed to. I wanted a practical flaw. Misfiled negative. Double exposure. Prank. Anything. There are more, she said. People remembering exhibits that had not been unpacked. Visitors asking after galleries we had never opened. Staff returning from ordinary tasks with revised histories. Not amnesia exactly. Replacement. The mind likes consistency. It will choose a false one over none at all. Walter. Yes. You knew this could happen to him? She looked annoyed, but not at me. I knew prolonged exposure increased the odds. I recommended retirement 5 years before he left. He refused. Exposure to what? The basement? The specimens? Margaret gave me a dry smile. You're still assuming those are separate nouns. That line from her memo came back to me. Storage classification is now inaccurate. I set the photo down carefully. Then explain it in plain language. She was quiet for a while. I heard the hot plate click as the kettle cooled. When the Valley team opened the chamber, she said, they believed they had discovered preserved biological impossibilities. What some of us came to suspect later was different. The chamber was not storing dead things. It was making comparisons, possibilities, variants, organisms that never entered our history, but could have under slightly altered conditions. Not fantasy. Adjacent reality, if you prefer a dramatic phrase. That's not a phrase I prefer. No, she said. I don't imagine it would be. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes briefly before continuing. When objects were transported here, the effect did not remain contained to the crates. Space around them behaved badly. Categories blurred. Boundaries softened. First memory, then placement, then sequence. Rooms implied other rooms. Inventories suggested items never accessioned. Eventually we understood something else. The collection was not being housed below. The space below was being generated by the act of collection. I heard myself laugh once, quietly, because it was either that or stand up and leave. That sentence means nothing. It means, Margaret said, opening her eyes again, that the basement doesn't contain the collection anymore. I stared at her. She spoke the next line very clearly, as if quoting a fact she had repeated enough times to lose any patience for disbelief. The collection contains the basement. That should have sounded theatrical. In her office, with the lamp light and the tea and the ordinary stack of interoffice envelopes on the desk beside us, it sounded worse. It sounded administrative, like a problem someone had been forced to define because it kept recurring. Why keep the museum open? I asked. Why not shut the place down, move everything, call someone? We tried moving portions of it, she said. Items returned, or records indicated they had never left. As for calling someone, whom exactly did you have in mind? The government? A university? A bishop? She made a small dismissive motion. Institutions absorb what they cannot solve. That is one of their oldest skills. Then the rule is all you have? The printed one? No. The printed one is what survives because it is short. She opened another drawer and took out a card no bigger than an index card. On it, in old typewriter lettering, were 3 lines. Do not follow familiar voices below. Do not read labels aloud. If you see yourself on display, leave without confirming details. I looked up. That last one happened before? Margaret held out her hand and I gave the card back. Mr. Mercer, there is no useful answer to that question. Who enforces this? You. Sometimes. A tired look crossed her face. Sometimes something else does. Before I left, she said one more thing. Your problem is not only curiosity, she said. It's guilt. Guilt makes people think the worst thing in a room will recognize them and offer meaning. If you go looking for explanation in that place, it will use what you bring. I nearly asked how she knew guilt had anything to do with me. Then I remembered old people in institutions hear more than anyone notices, and I kept my mouth shut. At the door she added, if someone enters the basement corridor willingly, do not follow. I saw that in Walter's notes. That made her pause. Then Walter left you more kindness than I expected. A child could die following a rule like that. Margaret's expression changed in a way I still cannot describe cleanly. Not sorrow. Not agreement. Something closer to resignation worn so thin it had become part of the bone beneath it. Yes, she said. That is one of the rule's defects. People always imagine the point of no return as a dramatic decision made in full knowledge. It wasn't like that. It came on a Wednesday morning attached to a school visit, a dropped lunch bag, and a child small enough to disappear behind a service cart if nobody was watching carefully. The museum hosted elementary groups a few times a month. On those days the staff arrived early, volunteers wore matching badges, and the gift shop stocked extra plush dinosaurs near the register. I usually had no part in it because my shift ended before the buses came, but that morning a staffing problem kept me late. Dennis asked whether I could stay an extra hour until daytime security sorted itself out. I said yes because overtime paid better and because I had spent the entire night badly distracted after another 117 descent. By 9:10 the lobby was full of second graders in bright jackets, chaperones with clipboards, and teachers doing head counts with the grim focus of military logistics. The ordinary noise of children should have made the building feel safer. Instead it made the place seem more layered. Beneath the chatter and shoe squeaks and volunteer greetings, I could still hear the other museum, the one made of vents and sealed doors and quiet machinery. I first noticed the girl because she was standing still. Most children in a museum either run ahead or fall behind. This one had stopped near the edge of the anthropology wing, holding a paper lunch sack in both hands, looking toward the service corridor with the freight elevator at the end. She wore a yellow raincoat several sizes too big for her and a plastic visitor sticker with Emma written in green marker. I was about 20 feet away helping a teacher locate the restrooms. By the time I looked back, Emma had turned the corner into the restricted hall. I moved after her immediately. There is a kind of walking adults do when they don't want to alarm a child or a crowd. Fast but not obviously fast. I remember passing a janitor's cart with one wheel that squealed softly, taking the corridor corner, and seeing the yellow coat ahead of me, bobbing once as she went through the service door we usually kept shut. Hey! I called. Wrong way. She did not turn. The corridor beyond was long, fluorescent, and empty except for a folded pallet jack against one wall. The freight elevator sat at the far end. Its doors were open. Not opening. Open. Emma walked toward it with the steady, mild concentration of someone following a parent through a grocery store. No panic. No hesitation. Her lunch bag swung once at her side. My radio crackled against my shoulder. Dennis was asking for an updated student count from the front desk. I answered without stopping, told him one child had slipped into a service area and I was retrieving her. I did not mention the elevator. Halfway down the corridor, I remembered Walter's note so clearly that it was like hearing him speak behind me. If someone enters the basement corridor willingly, do not follow. I actually slowed. That is the part one am least proud of. There are moments where you discover which part of yourself is real, and sometimes it is not the part you would choose. I had spent weeks telling myself I was investigating because I needed the truth. Standing there with a child walking toward the one door everyone feared, I understood there had always been another possibility beneath that. Part of me had wanted proof badly enough to let proof come to me. Emma stepped into the elevator car. The doors remained open. I could not see the interior clearly from that distance. The light inside looked wrong. Too soft for industrial fluorescence, almost amber. I started running. My shoes slapped the waxed floor. The radio bounced against my ribs. Emma did not react. I reached the outer doors just as she crossed the threshold and disappeared from view. Emma! I expected the doors to close. They did not. I reached the opening and stopped dead. The freight car should have been a metal box with grated interior gates and enough room for a couple of rolling crates. Instead, there was a landing of dark tile extending several yards inward to another corridor beyond, lit by brass wall lamps I had never seen anywhere in the museum. The air that rose from below smelled dry, mineral, and faintly medicinal, like old stone rinsed in alcohol. I heard children shouting in the lobby far behind me, some teacher calling for silence, ordinary life continuing at the other end of the building as if I were not standing in front of something impossible. Into my radio, Dennis said, "Mercer? Report." I looked down. The display still showed a small green G for ground floor. "Found her," I said. That was a lie. Bring her back. I should have obeyed the unofficial rule and the official one both. I should have backed away, called for help, dragged the lobby into chaos if necessary, done anything except step inside. But I could see the edge of Emma's yellow coat disappearing around the corridor beyond the landing. If she was sleepwalking, drugged, coerced, or simply a child following a voice I couldn't hear, she was still a child. Every abstract warning in the building suddenly had a very concrete shape. I crossed the threshold. The temperature changed at once. Not colder exactly. More sealed. The kind of air you notice in archive vaults and caves because it has been left alone. Behind me, the outer doors of the elevator remained open to the bright service corridor. I looked back twice in the first 10 seconds, half convinced they would vanish if I took my eyes off them. They stayed where they were. Ahead, the corridor opened into a chamber so large I could not understand it at first. My mind kept trying to scale it against the museum above and failing. It should not have fit beneath the building. It should not have fit beneath the block. Display cases lined the walls. Freestanding plinths rose from the floor. Overhead, dim hanging lights disappeared into a ceiling lost in shadow. I could see passageways branching farther out, galleries beyond galleries. The whole thing arranged with the unnerving logic of a museum and the impossible size of a dream. Emma stood 50 feet ahead of me in the yellow coat, looking up at a glass case with her lunch bag still in hand. I took one more step into that place. Behind me, very softly, the elevator doors began to close. The first thing I noticed once the doors shut was the quiet. Not silence. Quiet in the museum sense. The thick, respectful hush of carpeted galleries and sealed cases. The kind that makes you lower your voice even when no sign asks you to. My breathing sounded inappropriate. The soft crumpling of Emma's paper lunch bag as she shifted it from one hand to the other sounded almost rude. "Emma," I said as gently as I could. She glanced back at me. Her expression was calm, curious, not frightened. "I know," she said. Took me a second to understand what she meant. "I'm here to take you upstairs. They said you'd say that." "Who said?" She turned back to the case. I walked to her side and made myself look where she was looking. Inside the glass stood the articulated skeleton of an animal about the size of a deer, except the rib cage flared too wide and the forelimbs ended in narrow, delicate digits more like hands than hooves. The placard below it was brass, polished, and engraved in the same clean institutional style used upstairs. Ungulate primate transitional possibility 14B. Below that, recovered prior to occurrence. I did not read the rest aloud. Margaret's warning came back hard enough that I kept my mouth shut by reflex. "Come on," I told Emma. "We need to go." She let me take her hand. Her skin was cool and dry. We turned toward where the elevator should have been. It was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The wall behind us was uninterrupted stone between two display alcoves, one containing a series of jars with pale things folded inside them like sleeping bats. There was no seam in the stone, no door frame, no call button, nothing. If I tell you I stayed calm, I'm lying. I did not panic in the loud cinematic way people imagine. I did something less useful. I stood very still and tried to force the room to make practical sense by looking harder at it. The floor tiles were real, dark slate, slightly uneven. The wall lamps were real brass with green glass shades. Dust had gathered in corners. A label in one case had a tiny bubble under its laminate edge as if applied hastily. Practical details were everywhere, and each one made the impossibility worse. Emma tugged my hand. "They don't like when people turn around too fast," she said. "Who doesn't? The ones doing the shelves." I crouched to be closer to her eye level. "Emma, did someone bring you here?" She considered that. "Not bring. Show." Her attention shifted over my shoulder. I turned. A figure stood at the far end of the gallery. For one hopeful second I thought it was Margaret. The posture had that same dry uprightness, hands folded in front, head slightly bent. But the shape was too tall and wrong in proportion, all length and narrowness, wrapped in something that suggested a curator's dark suit only in the same way a paper mask suggests a face. It began walking toward us. I say walking because that is the least inaccurate term available. Really, it moved by accepting each position fully and then occupying the next without transition, like a series of still photographs advancing too smoothly. "Remain within the marked path," it said. The voice was not mechanical. It was careful, educated, genderless in the way old recordings sometimes are. There was no marked path. I took Emma's hand and backed away. The figure stopped 3 display cases short of us, as if respecting some distance known only to it. "Child accession incomplete," it said. "Escort classification uncertain." I heard my own voice come out dry and flatter than usual. "We're leaving. That may remain one of several remembered outcomes." I wish I could tell you I understood that sentence then. I only understood later that it had been trying, in its own way, to be honest. We moved sideways into a branching gallery. I decided quickly that my best chance was not to search for the elevator but to look for any continuity with the building above. Service stairs, freight ramps, a loading bay. Museums run on circulation routes whether the public sees them or not. The gallery opened into a larger chamber filled with cases arranged in concentric rows. Some held skeletons. Some held taxidermied animals whose anatomies slid just enough away from familiarity to make my head hurt if I looked too long. One contained 6 wedding rings suspended on wires above a bed of black sand. Another held a lunch tray, a child's sneaker, and a set of house keys. People's things. Then I saw the human figures. They stood in a row of waist-high glass enclosures like life-size reconstructions in a social history museum. Not posed theatrically, simply paused. A man tying one shoe. A woman looking over her shoulder with annoyance. A teenage boy holding a bus pass between 2 fingers. The details were exact down to skin texture and frayed cloth. They were not statues in any material I recognized. They looked like people held still so thoroughly that even the idea of movement had been cleaned off them. Emma did not react much. That scared me more than if she had screamed. I kept us moving, passing one case after another without reading labels. Once I glanced down by accident and caught enough to see a date range that extended 3 years into the future. At the far end of the chamber stood a case larger than the rest. I knew it before I reached it. There is a physical sensation that comes with seeing yourself unexpectedly. A photo you forgot was being taken. Your face in a dark store window. For a second, the mind does not recognize the body as home. It has to return to it. Inside the case stood me, not exactly as I looked in that moment, as if prepared for display. Uniform neat, hands relaxed at my sides, head angled slightly toward an unseen point to the left. My hair trim was from 2 weeks earlier. The scar on my chin was there. So was the pale crescent on my wrist from the donor estate where I cut myself on broken case glass the night I took the artifacts. The placard bore my name. I did not read further. I couldn't have if I tried. My eyes had fixed on the figure's belt. Hanging from it was a key ring with one key missing. Mine, in reality, felt suddenly lighter against my hip. Emma whispered, "That one is fresh." Behind us, the careful voice said, "Self-reference increases orientation failure. Please proceed in order." I turned. The curator thing stood at the mouth of the chamber. Up close, its face still resisted staying fixed in my mind. If I looked directly, I saw features. If I looked away and tried to remember them, I had nothing to remember. "What are you?" I asked, his head tilted. "Custodial function." For what? Possibility under pressure. Sequence under revision. Local history. Visitor variance. Returned material. It sounded like multiple filing systems speaking through one mouth. "Those people?" I said, forcing myself not to look back at the cases. "Are they dead? Classification unavailable. Can they leave? Some outcomes retain mobility. Do you make these?" Paused. "Collection is reciprocal." That answer landed in me with a sickening kind of clarity. It did not hunt in the simple sense. It recognized, compared, and retained. It used contact, memory, tension, maybe regret, maybe all the things people bring to old buildings when they believe the building is passive and they are not. Then it said, in the same steady tone, "The child may depart." Escort entry generated a matching requirement. Matching what? Witness. It looked at me as if waiting for me to file myself correctly. I understood two things then. First, it intended to let Emma go. Second, it had not made the same promise about me. "Get behind me," I told her. I wish I had some clever escape to describe. I don't. I acted on 2 scraps of advice and 1 bad instinct. Margaret had said not to read the labels aloud. Walter had written that old rules stopped working. And every museum I had ever worked in, honest or otherwise, had one operational weakness above all others: its need for order. I grabbed the nearest freestanding placard, yanked it from its mount, and flung it through the glass of the case beside us. The sound was enormous. Glass burst inward. Alarms did not ring, but the entire chamber seemed to tighten. Lamps dimmed and then brightened out of sequence. Somewhere far off, something like 100 pages turning at once rushed through the dark. The curator thing recoiled, not in pain exactly, but in disruption. The figure inside the broken case, a middle-aged man frozen halfway through lifting a hat, sagged forward by an inch. "Catalog breach," the entity said, and for the first time its voice lost composure. I did it again. Another placard, another case, shattering glass. Emma covered her ears. If the basement was built from collection, then disorder mattered. Not enough to destroy it, maybe just enough to force a gap. The floor shifted under us with a small but unmistakable tilt. One of the walls ahead flickered, not visually, not like light, but spatially. For an instant I saw the museum service corridor beyond it, bright and ordinary. A yellow caution sign and a mop bucket sitting exactly where they should have been upstairs. I ran for it, dragging Emma beside me. The curator moved with that impossible frame-to-frame speed and appeared in front of us just as we reached the opening. Up close, its suit resolved into something more like layered labels, accession cards overlapping to form sleeves and lapels. "Collection incomplete," it said. I did the stupidest useful thing of my life. I pulled my key ring free and jammed it straight into the place where its chest should have been. as if confronting a man in costume. Metal struck something harder than bone and softer than stone. The entity jerked backward. A dozen tiny brass tags spilled out of the gap and scattered over the floor with the thin, bright sound of dropped cutlery. The opening widened. Emma and I fell through into the service corridor above. Real fluorescent light hit my eyes. The mop bucket toppled. My shoulder slammed tile. Behind us, the freight elevator doors stood open for 1 second longer, revealing only darkness and a single brass lamp receding rapidly as if down a tunnel. Then the doors shut. Emma began crying only after we were back in the ordinary hallway, and once she started she couldn't stop. That, more than anything else, convinced me we had really come out. I held on to her and looked down. In my hand, mixed with my keys, was a small brass tag from below. It was stamped with an accession number. On the reverse side, in neat engraved letters, was my name. The official version of what happened that morning fit on half a page. A student became briefly separated from her tour group and wandered into a restricted service corridor. Security Officer Owen Mercer retrieved her without injury. Child was returned to school staff. Review of door monitoring procedures recommended. That was it. No basement. No impossible galleries. No broken cases. No mention of why Emma's teacher said the girl kept asking whether the downstairs animals would be lonely without her. No mention of the fact that I vomited in a staff restroom 10 minutes after Dennis took my statement, then washed my face and went back to the office because I did not trust myself to drive. Emma's parents were upset, naturally, but relief overrode everything else. Children wander. Museums are confusing. Adults make mistakes. Everyone preferred the version of the world where this was merely an embarrassing lapse. I watched Dennis file the report. His hands shook slightly only when he thought no one was looking. Margaret did not speak to me that day, but when she passed my desk that evening she placed a folded handkerchief beside the monitor. Inside it was a tiny shard of green-tinted glass like the shade from one of the lamps below. I never asked where she found it. The freight elevator corridor was locked for 48 hours, pending inspection. Then it reopened. The doors looked the same as always. The indicator worked. The call button had been polished. There was no dent in the tile where I had fallen and no record of maintenance activity beyond a routine systems check. I stood there on my next shift with my radio clipped to my belt and the brass tag in my pocket, feeling like a man who had woken from surgery and been told the removed organ had never existed. I should have quit immediately. Instead, I stayed another several weeks, and that is where the real damage settled in. At first, it was small. Lena asked me whether I was still taking sugar in my coffee. I had never taken sugar at work. She seemed mildly offended when I said so. "You always do after 2, she said. "You said black past midnight makes you jumpy." An old friend from college left me a voicemail referencing a weekend trip to Maine we had never taken. He described a lobster shack by name, laughed about me getting carsick on Route 1, and asked whether I still had the photo of us by the harbor. I checked my phone gallery later out of spite more than expectation. There was a photo of us by a harbor. I do not know how else to write that sentence. It was there among other real photos, time-stamped 4 years earlier, my jacket one I recognized, my friend heavier than he is now, the two of us squinting in cold sun with lobster traps behind us. I had no memory of the trip. None of the details in the image felt invented. They felt misplaced, like furniture returned to the wrong apartment. The changes kept coming. My mother called and casually mentioned that I had loved museums as a child. I had not. Zoos, yes. Baseball games, yes. Museums bored me. But she told a warm story about taking me to see a traveling fossil exhibit when I was 8 and my insisting on reading every card aloud. She remembered the red sweater I wore. I could picture the sweater. I could not picture the trip. At work, conversations developed histories I hadn't lived. Ravi asked whether Walter had ever returned the field guide he borrowed from me. Walter had never borrowed anything from me because Walter had quit before we became more than coworkers. Yet Ravi sounded annoyed at the delay, not uncertain. I started writing everything down in a spiral notebook from the gift shop, the kind with a mammoth on the cover. Dates, conversations, remembered facts, contradictions. I felt stupid doing it, but the notebook gave me one stable point. If memory was being revised, I wanted an external record made by the version of me that still noticed. 3 pages in, I found an entry I did not remember writing. Do not trust the footage if it flatters sequence. The handwriting was mine. I spent a full minute staring at that line. I knew the loops of my G, the pressure of my downstrokes, the way I crowded the right margin. It was my writing. The ink matched the pen clipped to the notebook. But I had no memory of putting the sentence there. That night, I reviewed the security archive from the morning Emma disappeared. The cameras showed the school group entering. They showed Emma separating from the others. They showed me following her into the service corridor. So far, accurate. Then the feed from that corridor showed us stopping outside the freight elevator. Not entering. Not vanishing. Stopping. Emma stood facing the closed doors. I stood a few feet behind her. We remained like that for 4 minutes and 19 seconds, both of us nearly motionless, as if listening to something out of frame. Then I took her hand, turned, and walked her back toward the lobby. That was the entire recording. No open doors. No impossible landing. No basement. I watched it 7 times. On the 6th viewing, I noticed one detail that made my scalp prickle. During those 4 minutes, although neither of us visibly moved, the key ring at my belt changed position 3 separate times between frames, as if my body and the recording disagreed on whether I had shifted. I showed the footage to no one. A few days later, I checked the spiral notebook again and found another sentence added beneath the first. If a record preserves you, it does not need to convince you. Only others. Again, my handwriting. I began sleeping badly. Not because of nightmares exactly, because of the sensation as I drifted off that some part of my life had become available for cross-reference. I would think of the theft from the private collection and suddenly doubt small surrounding facts. Had I taken 3 artifacts or 4? Had the donor's library smelled of cigar smoke or lemon polish? Had I always left through the side gate, or only in the version of events that now suited whatever was arranging me? That was the cruelest part. The basement did not merely frighten me, contaminated my guilt. It made the one solid wrong thing I had done feel unstable in shape, and somehow that felt worse than being absolved. Emma, I later heard through careful questions, stopped talking about the incident after 2 days. Then she started drawing museums at school. Her teacher thought it was a healthy way of processing stress. The drawings showed rooms underneath rooms underneath rooms. One afternoon, Margaret found me staring too long at the freight elevator monitor. "It has you now," she said quietly. I did not pretend not to understand. Can it be undone? No. Can it be contained? For a while. For how long? She looked at the screen where the empty corridor sat in black and white patience. "Long enough for an opening reception," she said. I turned to ask what that meant. She had already walked away. The invitation arrived on cream cardstock in my mailbox at the security office. Employee preview, new special exhibition. Local history opening night reception to follow. There was a printed note at the bottom encouraging all staff to attend before public launch. Dennis stopped by my desk that afternoon and said it would be good for morale if security showed face at museum events now and then. He sounded overly cheerful, which in him usually meant fear dressed up for work. I nearly threw the invitation away. Instead, I put it in my pocket and spent the week telling myself I was only going to confirm that Margaret's warning had been one more strained metaphor from an old woman trying to make dread sound manageable. The exhibit opened on a Friday evening in the renovated West Gallery. The theme, according to the promotional banners, was the region's hidden past. Industry, settlement, local ecology, vanished neighborhoods, all the respectable museum language used to turn dead people's belongings into education. The room looked beautiful. That is important to say. Clean cases, careful lighting, a wall-sized map of the county as it changed over centuries. School desk fragments from a closed one-room schoolhouse. Mill tools, taxidermied birds native to the wetlands before development. Families of donors drifted through with wine glasses. Trustees wore name tags and practiced interest. The center of the gallery held one large glass case under a dark green curtain. I saw Margaret near the far wall in a black cardigan, speaking to no one. She did not acknowledge me. Lena stood by the entrance with a paper cup of white wine she clearly did not want. Ravi was there too, looking impressed in a borrowed blazer. If anyone else felt the room was wrong, they hid it well. I did a slow circuit before the unveiling. The exhibits were normal at first glance, though a few captions gave me a mild headache if I read them too carefully. Dates nudged against memory. Street names were almost familiar but not quite. One display about early quarry workers included a group photograph in which I thought, for one awful moment, I recognized Walter. When I leaned closer, it was a stranger. Then the museum director tapped a spoon against a glass and welcomed us all. He thanked donors, the city council, the curatorial team, the design staff, and our invaluable collections personnel. His speech was polished and forgettable. While he talked, I noticed 3 people in the back of the crowd who did not fit. They were standing too still. One was Walter. The gray raincoat was gone. He wore a dark suit that looked a little old-fashioned, but his face was unmistakable. Not aged, not sick, simply calm in that open, mildly curious way I had seen after the outage. Beside him stood a woman I recognized from an archive photo of the Valley expedition. I had stared at that photo long enough to remember her name, Claire Voss. According to the files, she had never officially worked for the museum after the excavation. To Walter's other side was a boy of maybe 16 holding a bus pass between 2 fingers. I had seen him before too, in a glass case below. My body knew before my mind committed. I started moving backward through the crowd. Not enough to attract attention, just enough to put open floor behind me. People shifted for better views. Someone laughed softly at the director's joke about bringing the past to life. The curtain came down. Inside the case stood a museum night guard. My uniform, my build, my face, the coffee stain on the right cuff, the cheap black watch with the cracked crystal. The posture of someone who had heard a sound and not yet decided whether it required bravery or just inconvenience. There were approving murmurs from the crowd. Real admiration. I heard someone say, "Incredible detail." My name was on the plaque. Not Owen Mercer, local employee, honored for service. Just my name like a specimen or historical figure. I moved closer because some part of me still believed proximity would expose a trick. Wax, silicone, 3D scan. A cruel private joke by somebody who knew too much. The glass reflected the overhead lights and my own face as I approached, so for a second it looked like I was layered over the figure, one version standing outside, one inside. The plaque text began with my date of birth, then my childhood street, then my first job in a grocery warehouse, then the donor estate, not the official employment line, the private truth, the inventory room, the carved funerary charm with the chipped base, the silver coin packet, the ivory mask no larger than my palm. The line described my theft not as a crime or confession but as accession detail, as if my regret were merely another feature of provenance. Nobody around me reacted. A trustee couple stood shoulder to shoulder reading the same words and nodding with pleasant interest. Lena leaned in from my left, studying the case with a tired expression, and said, "They really got the watch right." I turned to her. "You know what this says?" She blinked. "Local security practices, I think." "Why?" When I looked back, the text had changed. Now it described my employment at the museum. Start date, shift hours, recorded habits, preferred routes during rounds. It noted that I avoided the East Hall after learning not to. It noted that I had entered restricted subgrade holdings once under emergent moral pressure. That line alone should have stopped anyone cold. No one seemed to notice. Across the room Margaret met my eyes just once. There was nothing encouraging in her face. Only confirmation. The crowd behind the case had thickened. More familiar people stood among the guests now, some from archive photos, some from nowhere I could place, all with that same composed attention. Walter smiled at me like a host pleased a late arrival had finally found the right room. I stepped to the edge of the case looking for any physical flaw, any seam, any proof of fabrication. There was none. The figure inside was not lifeless in the way mannequins are lifeless. It had the complete stillness of a thing that had already been settled. At the bottom of the plaque, beneath the main text, there was one final engraved line. I am certain it was not there when the curtain first came down. I would swear to that under oath even now, understanding how little that means. The line read, "Collection complete. Basement expansion approved." I looked up from the brass plate. The room had gone very quiet. Not socially quiet. Museum quiet. The kind of hush that assumes the next thing to happen has already been decided.